Well, there. One little break. Any questions on that before we move on to the next unit, which is looking at the brain? Yeah. So those are the two primary Western traditions. If you are aware of them, you will see them everywhere in Western thought. But I've also given you the problems. They're inadequate at so many levels. So the struggle is to find a way forward, and there are lots. If you start studying philosophy, you'll find that there are a lot of answers. I'm going to take us in a completely different direction. I'm going to take us in a direction called moral psychology. Rather than moral philosophy, so Kantian and utilitarian are moral philosophy, we're moving in the direction of moral psychology. How does the human brain process this stuff? Because I think that tells us a lot. And then I have a model that follows that out. That'll be part 3, which we might get to today and might not. Okay. I love this picture of the brain that I found on the internet. I couldn't find a source for it. It just sits there. I tried to track it back to find its original one, but I could not. So this is the side view of the brain. The reason I like this one, it actually has an eyeball in it, tucked there. And that's important because it begins to get a sense, it should have a tongue hanging out here and some nostrils, because those things are almost directly part of your brain. Your tongue, your eyes, your nose are so deeply wired into your brain that they're practically part of your brain. In fact, there are those folk who would argue, and I'd be very close to them, that we should really think of your brain as your whole central nervous system. That is, the central nervous system it talks about is, in fact, your brain. It's your whole body. Because what's really clear from the research is we behave thoughtfully faster than our brain functions. That's really, really weird. Okay? That is, we cue our bodies to perform in intelligent, interactive ways with our environment. And then our brain catches up once we see what's going on. So if you're walking into a room full of strangers, you actually cue a whole set of things around, what if there's somebody here that I recognize? Your body is primed to spot such people and react to them in a positive way before your brain has identified that there's any such person in the room. And we can track it and see that that is in fact going on, that the difference is measurable. You are starting to respond positively to a stranger, and your brain hasn't even recognized that there's a stranger in the room. Okay, well, how's that? Well, it's because we stack stuff up in our body. We prepare ourselves for things. It's like we have apps spread through our whole bodies that they're all primed and ready to go. They just need cueing, and they're off and running, and then we respond. So, anyway, brief overview of the brain. Has 3 basic systems. The cerebrum, which is actually pretty much all of this stuff up there. It's the higher level, most recently evolved. Share it with all mammals in some respects. The complexity, though, gets simpler and simpler. I won't say down the evolutionary ladder, because there is no evolutionary ladder. But simpler mammals have much simpler brains, but they're structured so that if you took them apart, you could say, oh, it looks like a human brain. Just simpler and smaller. Because they do. They're modeled the same way, but they are much simpler and much smaller. Then inside of it is the limbic system. So that's these things, the hypothalamus, the amygdala. They're up inside. You can kind of see this gray stuff in there. That's trying to show you that there is an inner part of your brain. And it's quite literally inside. There's another brain. And you share it with, oh goodness, which class of creatures have that level of brain? But it's responsible for doing a lot of what is your emotional processing, managing your body, those kinds of things, in complex ways. However, the way it's evolved in human beings, it's so deeply tied into all the rest of this, you can't really say it's doing something without all the rest. because we'll find out. And then there's the basal or hindbrain, which is down here, which keeps your body breathing, that monitors hunger, that monitors the very basic functioning of your body. And you share that with all basic animal kinds of life forms. Lizards and frogs and snakes have that level. I mean, your basic frog recognizes that something is small, try to eat it. Large, try to avoid it. Same size, try to mate with it. Done. That's all the recognition it has. It's got these great eyes, but that's all the brain will process. That's about all that will process. And it keeps breathing and digesting and doing that basic stuff. That's that part of the brain. Okay, so that's your brain. Extraordinary. What I love about your brain is if you start tracking the neural complexity of it, there are more pathways in your brain than there are atoms in the universe, which is really amazing. You start thinking of what that indicates in terms of the complexity of what's going on in here. That is, each neuron, and you have billions of neurons, each neuron has thousands of pathways that connect up to the other thousands of pathways, leading very quickly to trillions, and then just keeps on adding and adding to that in terms of the complexity of what you can do with it. It is extraordinary. It is the single most complex aspect in the universe. As far as we know, there is nothing more complicated than the human brain out there. Kind of amazing. Two operational systems: the central nervous system, that your ability to control your body and manage it, and then the autonomic nervous system, it's your unconscious organ management at the very basic level. And all of that is interacting all the time. It isn't like right now your cerebrum is functioning, then it's the limbic system, and you know. It's like if you're interested in how it goes, you try crossing a busy street while working on a difficult problem. You can't do it. You simply can't manage your physical environment and all the things to do with effective walking if you're also trying to think about a complex problem. That is, you're just using too much capacity, doing too much stuff, because all of this stuff interacts. Now, theoretically, you've got the capacity, but because these systems are all interacting, they're all literally taking from each other, calling on each other, looking for access to you. Anyway, fascinating stuff. Love to spend a lot of time on it. So what is the brain then? For our points of view, it's the center of learning. Okay? That is, it's an organic matrix for remembering things. Powerfully does so. And so for our case here, learning how to make right and wrong decisions and what right and wrong feel like. That's all located in our brain. Neural pathways in our brain that carry that kind of stuff. We don't have some kind of moral cloud drifting around out there. It's literally in our brain. If there's damage to your brain, your sense of right and wrong, your experience of right and wrong, your ability to think about right and wrong will all change. And there's some really interesting experiments that have been done, accidental or deliberate, where if there's damage to the frontal part of people's brains, they become much more emotional, much more easily emotionally triggered, much less able to think through complex problems, solve complex problems, think about right and wrong. Well, it's because most of that stuff goes on in the front. It uses the rest, but it goes on in the front of your brain. You have two parallel systems that integrate to process all of your perceptions. This is complicated. So you've got part of your brain that does a detailed analysis. So you hear something, you see something, whatever, you've got part of your brain goes through, okay, what am I hearing, seeing, tasting, feeling? Think it through in its details. Okay? Takes time. So you've got a much faster system that's doing exactly the same thing at the same time, but it does it much more weakly, but looking for associations with emotion. It's very closely tied to your threat warning system. So you may be tasting something and you're trying to figure it out, but another part of you is going, is it a poison or not? What have I tasted that's really bad in the past? Is this like that? What made me sick 3 weeks ago? Is this like that? And it's doing these very quick associations with memory and emotion to tell you, hey, spit this out. I don't care. You don't get a chance to really taste your food. You have to spit it out now. Okay? That's the quick, and then you've got the detailed. They don't necessarily agree with each other. This one is threat primed. That is, it's looking for damaging, scary stuff all the time. Heavily tied to your emotions, which are heavily tied to your memories. What is bad is gone. But there's also stuff in your brain that you're pre-wired for. Anybody here afraid of snakes? If you're not, it's kind of interesting. Because we have snake fear circuits in our brains. But not everybody's got them. So, about 80% of people respond automatically with fear when they see a snake, even if they've never seen one before in their whole lives.
Yes.
Spiders? Yes. It's about the same, 80%. Another 20% go like, what's the problem? It's a cute little spider. I like it. Okay? Another 80%, they're running away in fear. Okay? And they've never seen one before. Okay, we've got some stuff that's wired into our brains for that. But most of the rest we've learned. Okay? Dogs. How many people are afraid of dogs? That's a learned one. That's all learned. Because dogs have worked really hard to condition human beings over the millennia to really like them. They need us. We don't need them. They need us. That's fascinating. Who domesticated whom? Dogs have done as much to domesticate humans as humans have to domesticate dogs. Okay? It's fascinating. Anyway, the result is all analysis has an emotional valence. That is, this quick association is feeding everything all the time. Doesn't matter who you are, where you are, what you're doing, you're getting from this a little trickle in the background. Always. That's affecting the way you're responding to what's going on around you. There's no way that you can simply function on that. Those are two parallel systems, and they're always feeding together to your decision-making parts of your brain. You always have emotion. Always. Okay. But there's something else that goes on in our brains. Now this is what, okay, that's well established. This is in the research. It is solid. What appears to be true to a whole bunch of us, but the research is not solid yet, I think it'll get there, is this part. We have moral emotions that emerge from the unconscious analysis and memory. They're not immediately tied to this, but they're not separate from it either. That is, the emotion triggers a certain moral sense as well. And that then guides all subsequent decision making. The core researcher working on this is a guy named Jonathan Haidt, who I've mentioned before in class. I like his work, I don't like his stuff. He's made, I think, the absolutely solid case that this is what's going on. Where I disagree with him is his analysis of what it means. I quite disagree with him. I think he's misreading something significantly. But regardless, we both agree. There are moral emotions. They're fundamental to the way we interact with the world. Every time we see something out of this stuff, we're triggered there with a moral emotion. Sense primarily of disgust or satisfaction with what we're seeing. It can be a very low level or very high level. It'll depend. But we feel it. We have this moral sense we carry. So, for example, if you walk out of this class today going, I didn't learn anything, you don't go, I didn't learn anything. You go, it was a bad class. And it has moral valences to it. Because you didn't learn, and you expected to learn, so you apply a moral statement to it, a moral feeling to it. You can't help it. That's just the way we are. It's just what we do all the time. Or you go about saying, whoa, what a class. I learned so much. Well, you learned some stuff, so what? Yeah, but it felt good. It felt morally right to be learning a whole bunch. Why? Well, it just does. It's just the way our brains respond. They give us a little moral kick to go with whatever is going on. If we like it, if it fits our expectations, it's a moral kick that's positive. If it doesn't fit, it's a moral kick that's negative. So that's going on. It's not as well tested as this. This is rock solid. That, I think it's dead solid as well, but the researchers are still working on trying to figure it out, because this gets really complicated, and that's where we'll end up going, is into that level of complexity. And yeah, the tough stuff. So snakes, spiders are built in. It's a lot of stuff built into that brain. The issue here is we think we have minds that are rational, that are independent, that are thoughtfully reflective on the world. There's kind of a little person inside our head observing the world as it's going by, and it makes good, sensical decisions. Now, not true. We have brains. Brains do their stuff, and the mind, which does exist, is actually a projection of part of your brain. But there's a lot of other stuff going on all the time that deeply influences your mind before it actually is awake and alert. Okay? So we can do powerful things with our minds, do extraordinary things with our minds. But our brains have already primed them in lots of different ways, built on built-in patterns that we've all got. So, we have a deep bias to survival as organisms. Now that's really fascinating, because we can actually do things which are counter-survival. Yeah, we can violate what it takes to survive. Human beings do it all the time, often with a deep sense of moral satisfaction. That is fascinating, but that doesn't matter. The normal tendency, though, is to orient everything in terms of what maximizes your personal well-being. Under normal conditions, that's where you go. It makes perfect sense, too. If you were not oriented towards your own survival, you might not survive. If you're not watching for traffic with a little bit of anxiety, next thing you know, you've walked out in front of a truck. End of things. Happens often enough here in Vancouver. I know that there are people who are missing that one. They're not wired enough for survival. So, to go with that, you end up with very rapid reactions to perceived threats. Not real threats, perceived threats. What is a real threat? Well, it's a perceived threat that actually has evidence to support it. You don't need real threats. You'd better be reacting to perceived threats if you're going to survive. Because if you wait to find out if the wavy motion in the grass is a lion, you're lion lunch. You're not a survivor who's running away. No, you run away first. Then you find out, yes, it was lions, or no, it was just a pattern that the wind was causing. Okay? So the anxiety, the perceived threat is more important than the real threat. Okay, you have a part of your brain which is deeply convinced or controlled by or oriented to anxiety, and that's the amygdala. It's part of the midbrain, the inner part that's inside, and it's wired into everything. So it's assessing, it's tied to memory and emotion very deeply. It is just one of those critical pieces in your brain. And it's looking at three different things. Well, we'll leave this one out. Acute anxiety. Okay? You have seen the tail of the lion coming through the grass. Okay, we've seen something. We've got real anxiety. Okay? But that typically might build on chronic anxiety. That is, we're going out into the grasslands. We know that there may be lions out there, so our anxiety gets triggered. We don't know. It's an imagined threat. There may not be. Mm-hmm. Then we see the tail. Now we know. Okay, so we move from chronic to acute. Chronic anxiety triggers a whole lot of stuff in our bodies and our brains, cueing us to really quickly move into acute anxiety. That is, now it's time to fight or run away or freeze, do any of our deep danger avoidance behaviors. But chronic anxiety is about being really, really